Today, we're concluding this series on David, and over the past 5 weeks, we've talked through a couple different attributes that King David had. The first one was faithfulness, then it was honoring leadership, humility, integrity, and forgiveness. If you missed any of those, I would encourage you to go back on YouTube and check out the message that you missed, because each of those things that David either has shown throughout his life, or he might have had a momentary blip or problem with it and then was able to bring things back together again. But all of them are essential to our lives. But I would say today, the one that we're going to be talking about is the most important one. You see, I can look at that list and I can say someone who's not following God can still be faithful to do what they say they're going to do. They could still honor leadership. They could still be humble. They could still have integrity. They could still offer and receive forgiveness. But today's is the one that really sets David apart. When you look at David and you look at the Psalms, the thing that we see coming out of David's life on a consistent basis is his desire to worship God Almighty. We'll try that one again. Is the worship God Almighty. You see, I'm struggling with my voice, so I'm going to need you to start throwing back at me. Because here's the thing, and you're going to hear this through this message, that it's all about worshiping God, and that's why we come. If you're coming to check a box off on the list, why bother? It's about God. It's always been about God, and we need to put him first and foremost in everything we do, because what we're going to see in this message today is Israel under Saul's leadership knew where the presence of God was but didn't experience the presence of God, chose to not experience the presence of God because they wanted to put their focus on a political leader in King Saul instead of on the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And because of that, they suffer over and over and over again. And so as we talk about worship, we're going to break down the passage in 2 Samuel chapter 6, where the Ark of the Covenant returns to Israel, and David dances before the Lord. And so this is one where David, a lot of times, we look at it like, David, did he go a little bit too far? No, he did not go too far. He went exactly where he was supposed to be. But the thing is, I can't preach this message without giving you the context behind it. Because it's one thing to say, oh, why wasn't the Ark of the Covenant where it was supposed to be? And the key to it is the Ark of the Covenant was, they knew where it was, but they didn't want to engage with the Ark of the Covenant. They didn't want to engage with worship of God. And I think that's one of the problems we can run into as an American church, is we know where to find the presence of God, but we don't spend any time engaging the presence of God. Because it becomes inconvenient for us because, well, what if God disrupts my life? How many of you, like, let's be honest, how many of you have ever had that moment where you feel like God is disrupting my life and it's uncomfortable and I don't like it and it's not fun? Anyone? Here's the thing, is in the moments where God disrupts your life is the moments where God is getting ready to use you. And your refusal to allow God to disrupt your life says my plan is more important than God's plan, and that's going to line you up with the pathway of King Saul and not King David. And the pathway of King Saul does not end well. King Saul chose to not worship God. King Saul chose to not put his emphasis on God, and it leads him to a place where he is removed from all his power and authority. I don't want that for you, because I want you to have the power and the authority and the giftings and the anointing that God has placed on your life so you can accomplish the will of God for your life. You guys are quiet. I need you louder. There we go. Because church, I'm going to be honest. I know there's a reason why I woke up with no voice today. And it's because this very message is a message that I feel like God's placed on my heart to preach. I think it's something that we struggle with as a church, that we need to be individuals who are fully 100% engaging in worship. And for some reason, this is a stronghold and a wall and a barrier sometimes for our church. I'm not saying the church or this church down the street or the American church. I mean for our church, where we need to just walk up to the wall and just start hitting it with a sledgehammer and saying this wall needs to come down for us to be able to go through. We want to accomplish and do great, incredible things, but we're unwilling to push through what's uncomfortable for us. So today, and I'm honest, I preach better when I feel like you guys actually are hearing me and listening and engaging. So if I say something, you're like, okay, that's true, amen. All right? If I say something that's sacrilegious, you can talk with me afterwards. But I need you with me today because I'm going to push and give every ounce of energy I have this morning. I need you to come along with me. Repeat after me. Heavenly Father, your word is written in my mind and hidden in my heart. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. I will seek you with all of my strength. My greatest desire is to be a disciple and to make more disciples. I will live my life according to your word. Your word, O Lord, is eternal. So here's the biblical context of 2 Samuel 6. We're going to read that passage in just a little bit. But as you remember, David is the second king of Israel. Saul was the first king. God's plan was for Israel to not have a king. It was a series of judges and of prophets, and that God was speaking to his individual at the time to give God's word to the people, but ultimately God was the one ruling the country. And Israel looked around and said, no, we want to be like all the other nations. We want to be just like them. We want a king as well. And so God gives them Saul. Saul becomes a king primarily just because Israel wants a military commander to lead them into battles. They want to look like everybody else. They don't want to do it. And here's the thing. They always had a leader. They had Moses. They had Joshua. They had all these judges. But they wanted to look like everyone else. They wanted to have a king. And this is one of the things that I think comes up against the American church. We want to look like the world too much. Let me just let you in on a little secret. That imagine, we say, well, we want God to be in charge of America again. We want God back in our nation. Then how about we start acting and living like it? And that means maybe we're stopping watching the things that you're watching, listening to the things that you're listening to. You say, well, I just watched Fox News. Well, maybe you need to get out of Fox News and into God's Word. Because I know sometimes what God's Word says is that foxes chase us around and get us going in different places. Maybe we need to spend a little bit less time to the news of the world, and we need to spend a little bit more time in what God's saying, because God's word is alive and it's active. It's sharper than a two-edged sword. It has the ability to cut away the things that aren't supposed to be there, so we're able to follow after what God has for us. See, there we go. That's good. But here's the thing is, we want to look so often like the world, and we want the world to look like us, but in reality, God has called us out of this world, that we are in this world, but not of this world. So that means we have to live differently, but Israel didn't want to live differently. They wanted to look like everyone else, but have God bless them. That's not how it works. When you want to be able to do what God's called you to do and operate under the blessing of God, sometimes you have to look a little bit different. Sometimes you have to give it a little bit more effort. And so David becomes king, and he has a larger view for the kingdom. He's established a new capital city in Jerusalem, a neutral territory designed to unite all these tribes. You see, Saul was kind of leading this ragtag group of tribes. David was trying to bring it all together. And under David, the Philistines were not just resisted, but they were vanquished. I think too often in our world today, the problem is that we just want to resist the devil instead of vanquishing the devil. Let that one sink in for a moment. You say, well, the Bible tells us to resist the devil and he'll flee. Yes, resist the devil when he flees and he comes up against you. But at what point are we going to say, okay, Satan, you're done? But we mess around too much. We allow Satan too much into what's going on. We need to realize that there's coming a day where God is going to vanquish Satan forever. So why don't we start doing it in our own personal lives? When we get to eternity, that's not going to be like Satan gets to come up once every 10 years and go up against you. No, he's vanquished. So let's start practicing that and saying, Satan, you have no stronghold. You have no foothold here in this area of my life. And so here's what ends up happening is that Saul, he wants to do things his own way, that the worship of the Lord has languished, that Saul disobeyed the Lord's direction through Samuel, and ultimately the Ark of the Covenant, where God's presence rested in the Old Testament, had been lost a generation before. Before Samuel became the prophet, before Saul became the king, the Ark of the Covenant had been lost back in 1 Samuel chapter 4. It gets returned to them in chapter 6. But in chapter 5 of 1 Samuel, the Philistines had taken the Ark. They had paraded the Ark around as a war trophy in Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. Gath, the same Gath that Goliath came from. So when all of a sudden, this is happening before David faces Goliath. So when Goliath comes on the scene, he's this mighty warrior. A lot of scholars put him somewhere in that range of 30 to 35. That means that when he was a child, that the Philistines are moving this ark around Philistine, and they're moving it from city to city, including his city, and they don't want it in any one given city because everyone who experiences the Ark of the Covenant in the nation of a Philistine, that they are getting sick. And so they say, get this out of here. After 7 months, the Philistines say, enough, get this back. We're giving it back to the Israelites. We're giving back the presence of God to the Israelites because it's messing us up. And so they put it on a cart, they attach two ox to it, and they wheel it back to Israel. And so what ends up happening then is the Israelites get it back in chapter 6, and in the beginning of chapter 7, we see that it arrives in Kiriath Jearim and remains there for 20 years. And Saul never goes to experience the presence of God. And here's the dangerous thing that happens. We know where the presence of God is, but we don't interact with the presence of God. It's like that idea of saying, hey, I know where my Bible is. It's up on the bookshelf. I know where I can go to get truth, but I'm going to go and look for truth in all the other places. Whether the news media, the internet, my friend, a neighbor, through TikTok, Facebook, fill in the blank. I'm going to go to all these other places where truth is on the bookshelf, but we won't grab truth because it's too inconvenient for us, because it's going to challenge us and it's going to say, you got to throw everything out the window. You got to stop believing what you're believing, and you got to start doing something different. So I'm going to go where people are affirming me. And see, it's easy to look at the world and say the world is looking for people to affirm them, but the problem is the Christians are doing the same thing. We're looking for someone to justify the fact that we're not going 100% and we're only going just far enough. I can tell you this, that going through this process in the last 2 weeks of taking in a foster child has completely wrecked our sense of normalcy. My day off from now until who knows when is being spent in Taylor, allowing our foster daughter to have visits with both of her parents independently. So 5 hours out of my day is set aside for the purpose of just sitting in Taylor, waiting to pick her back up, where for 45 minutes she cries the entire way back. Here's the thing. The system is broken. When's the church going to step up and do something about it? You see, I could preach it before, but I'm experiencing it now and it's different. But what's the passion that God's placed on your heart? I don't want to hear as a pastor, well, here's what the church should do. No, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to worship? It's time that we get up off the seats and actually do something. You see, worship is coming into a place like this and singing and lifting the name of God on high. It absolutely is. But if we don't do anything with it, then it's just empty worship. It's just singing words. If you're not living it out, it's just singing words, and what's the value to it? We become like Saul and say, hey, I know where the presence of God is, but I'm not going to do anything about it. The presence of God is here, and it's been there for 20 years, and I'm not going to do anything about it. And in his paranoia, Saul began trying to do things his own way. He slaughters the priests who tended the tabernacle at Nob in 1 Samuel 22, 18 through 19. And was no longer able to seek the Lord because Abiathar, the remaining priest, took the ephod with him when he fled to David in 1 Samuel 22. He had no way now of experiencing and interacting with the presence of God. So what does he do? We get to 1 Samuel chapter 28, and Saul goes to seek guidance from the witch of Endor, not from Star Wars, but from the Bible, and the goes to a spiritualist medium so that he can talk to the Samuel who's dead. Because he can't experience God for himself. This is why I tell you, you have to be in God's word for yourself. You need to know God's word for yourself. You need to be in prayer yourself. You need to be spending time worshiping yourself. You cannot rely on someone else to experience the power of God. And so David longs to renew the nation in the worship of God, and to do that, he brings the long-neglected ark into his new capital city as a sign that the Lord, the true king over Israel, is in the midst of his people, and he wants to unite the people with Jerusalem, not just as a political leader, not just as a war leader, but as the religious center of every single thing that they do. And so often it's this matter of, does the church become something where this is where my cultural is, this is what my identity is, I was growing up in the church, this is where I'm comfortable, this is part of my routine. No, it has to go beyond that. It has to become the central thing of who you are. So that leads us to our text this morning, or the first part of it at least, 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 15. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out in the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. And it was told King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belonged to him because the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. So here's the first point out of this passage, the decision to return the ark. The decision to return the ark was not just a random idea that David had one day and said, "You know what, this would be really cool. It's been there, we should bring it back here, like it's some kind of artifact that it's going to go into a museum." It was the idea of saying, I want to make central the worship of God again, that this is the most important thing for our kingdom. The whole assembly of Israel comes together. He brings army leaders, he brings everybody, he gets all this buy-in to bring the ark back. Everyone is there and they're willing and they're ready to go to say that we're going to worship God Almighty. In 1 Chronicles 13, 2-3, we actually see the speech that David gave about returning the ark. It says, "And David said to all the assembly of Israel, 'If it seems good to you and from the Lord our God, let us send abroad to our brothers who remain in all the lands of Israel, as well as to the priests and Levites in the cities that have pasture lands, that they may be gathered to us. Let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul.'" My worry is so often in our nation that we start looking at it and saying, we're going to get through as long as the right person that we like is in office, as long as I'm in the right job, as long as I have the right people surrounding me, everything's going to be okay. No, everything is going to be okay if we are found perfectly in the center of the will of God. But that might not be comfortable. That might not be where we want to be. That might not be convenient to us, but we are safest when we're in the middle of the will of God. And how do we know that? Because when David didn't go to war, he got wrapped up with Bathsheba and it messed everything up. So here's the thing that I want to encourage you with is that in these moments where you say, okay, well, what does God want me to do? He wants you to be in the center of worship of him. That it's all about him, it's not about us. And here's the thing that happens, though. David sets the right goal. David goes about it in all the right ways, but he does it one wrong way. He doesn't ask God how to do it. He starts just doing it his own way. And he starts transporting the ark man's way. And apparently, while David had a lot of it right, he didn't spend the time to do the research and the homework to read through the Torah, which would be our Old Testament today, and up to that point, because obviously more was written after David, but about how the ark should be transported. Instead, he actually does a big mistake. He sends it back to Jerusalem in the same manner that the Philistines had sent it back to Israel, and that was by putting it on a cart and allowing 2 ox to pull it. He doesn't do it the right way. And as he does this, and they're moving it, that Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, they're guiding the new cart. It starts to shake because of one of the oxes taking a bad step, and he reaches out and to stabilize the Ark of the Covenant, and he's not supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. Because when you look through the law, he was not the right person to be touching a holy item like that. And so the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his act, and God struck him down. And those are those moments where I look at the Old Testament, like, I can't explain why. Like, could there have been a different punishment? Sure, if I'm God, but I'm not God. There's moments like this where you're like, well, if I was God, I wouldn't do that. But at the same time, I'm also glad I'm not God, because I'm not the one that has to decide where I give grace and where I don't give grace to. Because if I was the one that had to decide that, there's a lot of people that wouldn't get grace. And if you were God, then you probably may not throw grace my way. I don't know. But here's the thing. We're not God, so we need to look at what God's word says and follow it as closely as we possibly can. This actually recalls the severe punishment upon the men of Beth Shemesh for looking in the ark in 1 Samuel 6:19. At that time, they had said, "Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God?" A holy God insists that holy things be treated with reverence in the manner that he prescribed, not us. But here's the thing, we're going to take a little pause from this passage with David for a moment. The Ark of the Covenant was the resting place for the presence of God. It would eventually find its way into the temple once the temple is built, and it would not just be in the outer courts or the inner courts or the holy place, but in the Holy of Holies behind the great veil that was a thick veil where only the high priest could go once a year after all kinds of sacrifices and different things were taking place. And even then, they would tie bells around his ankles so that if he went in there and they stopped hearing the bells, they could pull out his dead body if he went in and he was not holy enough in that particular moment. But here's the thing that we know about Jesus, that when Jesus went to the cross, that veil was torn. You see, because the presence of God rested upon the Ark of the Covenant. But the second Jesus died on the cross, that veil was completely torn from top to bottom, that all of a sudden you could see in and see where the presence of God was on the Ark of the Covenant. But now all of a sudden the presence of God isn't there, because as we're going to learn next week and celebrate next week on the week of Pentecost, all of a sudden the power of the Holy Spirit comes down and breathes on us as individuals. And so now the resting place of God is no longer on an ark in the middle of the Holy of Holies. The presence of God is in you. And so we can get excited about that, but let me just explain something. This is why worshiping God matters so much, because you represent now the Holy of Holies. Because you now contain the presence of God. And as such, that means that when it comes time to worship, you've got to worship. You can't just say, you know what, I don't really feel comfortable. If I'm being honest, my voice hurts right now preaching like this, but I'm preaching like this because I need you to get it. And I'm going to pay for this for the rest of today and probably tomorrow. But here's the thing, if you get it, it's worth it. And so while it's not comfortable for me, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyways, because I need you to understand the importance of this message. Your worship is not about you. It's not about the style of the song. It's not about anything else other than putting the worth of God back on him. And as representative of the presence of God, as you take it out of here, you cannot live the same way that you used to live. You simply can't. You have to say, you know what, I am the representation of the Holy of Holies, the people that have never met Jesus Christ, that when they look at me, they get to see something different because there's something different in me. And if there's something different in me, it can't be the same as the rest of the world, and it might not be convenient. There's moments, let me just be honest, in the last 2 weeks that we've had interaction with friends, with family, with random strangers, and we said, hey, we're doing foster care, that I've heard people say, oh, you guys are saints. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm anything but. Like just the frustration and those thoughts that come in my mind, but it's a representation of what Jesus would do. It's not about me, but it's about Jesus through me and what people are seeing through me because I'm allowing God to work in me. So let's go back to David. David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah. And why was David angry? The text doesn't specifically say it, but we can kind of surmise two different reasons. First, David feels a little bit misunderstood, that David was doing all of this with his best of intentions. He loves God, he wants to honor God, and he feels like he's doing it right, but now all of a sudden, why is God's judgment coming? And the second is David feels humiliated. He's kind of publicly humiliated as a king. He has a national celebration. He's brought 30,000 plus onlookers to see this, and now all of a sudden he's saying, I'm going to do what God's called me to do, and then someone dies because of it. So David probably has some humiliation going on. He feels misunderstood, and he doesn't know what to do. He's angry, but he's not stupid, so he sends everybody home if they haven't fled already. And he makes arrangements for the ark to stay at the nearby home of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And it stays there for 3 months, and Obed-Edom is blessed. But during this time period, David starts doing his homework. And he starts making a new plan, a plan to transport the ark God's way. When David learned that Obed-Edom is being blessed with the dangerous ark at his house, David realizes that the ark itself was not the problem and that he wants that blessing to make it to the city of David. He begins to research in the Torah about how the ark is supposed to be transported and discovers that no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God because the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him forever. So this is the way that the ark was carried from the Jordan River as Joshua was leading the people into the promised land. However, the people have forgotten about this because it was hundreds of years before. Nevertheless, instructions are filled throughout the Pentateuch through the first 5 books of the Bible in Numbers 4 through 15, Numbers 4, 19 through 20, Numbers 7, 9, Deuteronomy 10, 8, Deuteronomy 31, 9. There's plenty of instruction, and here's the thing, is when we stop paying attention to God's word, we forget what the instruction is, and when we forget what the instruction is, we do it our way, and when we do it our way, we likely do it wrong. Stop doing it wrong. Stop it. Start doing it God's way. But specifically, this is the beauty and the amazing just coincidences of God, that the Kohathite clan of the Levites is charged with carrying the sacred objects from the tabernacle. And it just so happens that Obed-Edom is a Levite from the Kohathite town of Gath-Rimmon. What are the chances? It's kind of like God knows what he's doing. And at a certain point in time, we just have to sit back and say, okay, God, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know why you're doing it, but I'm just going to trust you because I've seen you do enough miracles. I've seen you do enough things over and over again. I watched something this morning that it really hit me. It was from Pastor Matt Chandler that he was talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they go before the Nebuchadnezzar in the fiery furnace. And they make this statement of like, we're not going to worship you. We're going to continue to worship our God because our God is able to deliver us. How many of you are excited that God can deliver you? That he can and he will. But they follow up with this statement, but even if he doesn't, he's still God. There's so many moments in our life where we say, okay, God, if you're in charge, then you got to do this right now, in my way, in my timing, in my desires. That's not what God promises. God promises healing. The healing might come on this side of eternity. It might come on the other side of eternity. God can heal. God will heal. But he might not heal the way you want him to heal. God might not restore things the way you want him to restore them. He might not do things in the timing that you want him to do it. But he can. He will. But even if he doesn't, he's still God. And so David's realizing this of saying, you know what? I tried doing it my own way, in my own timing, in my own ability. It didn't work. God, what is it that you want me to do? And so he studies, he figures out the right way of doing this, and instantly, all of a sudden, now the ark can go back to where David felt it was called to go. And so it comes into town, and that leads us to our last main point today, is that David dances before the Lord. So now this is 2 Samuel 6, verses 16 through 23. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread and a portion of meat and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today day, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes, and by your female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. David is personally absorbed in the joyful worship of God. And this is not some formal exercise of worshiping, but this was everything, giving everything he had. I want you to think back in your mind a moment where you were worshiping God and you just laid it all out on the table. You weren't worried about anyone else in the room. You weren't worried about what this person thought, that person thought. You weren't worried about your past. You weren't worried about your future. You were just lost in that particular moment, and that's David here. Because now, all of a sudden, the presence of God has been gone for decades, and the presence of God was back where it belonged. Now, all of a sudden, God could move and do what he intended to do, that the presence of God is here, and he's not going to care about what anybody else thinks. And he gets back to his house, and Michal, who was his first wife, questions him about his behavior, saying that it was below the dignity of a king, and that he responds, guess what? I'll become even more undignified than this if that means worshiping the God that I serve. And I will be more humiliated in my own eyes. Why? Because of his humility. You remember when we talked about humility, it was this. He's thinking of himself less, not less of himself. And realizing that the people finally have the presence of God back. So who cares about me? David realized his place in all this is that there never was supposed to be a king that was a man. It was all about the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's where the worship is. And all of a sudden, that king is back on the throne, is back in the middle of the city, back to lead, and that David just becomes the leader underneath the King of Kings. Often we become inhibited in our worship by what others might think of us, what other people might think if I say amen or I lift my hands in worship. Sometimes, let me just encourage you with this. When you feel called of, you know what, I'm going to lift my hands in worship, or I'm going to say amen, or I'm going to come to the altar during worship time, or I'm going to do this, that, or the other, sometimes you doing that is what is going to break it for someone else. Sometimes you say, well, I could get water baptized, but it's not that big of a deal. No, you getting water baptized might make someone else make that commitment themselves. Sometimes it's a matter of God speaking to you to walk through and follow through on obedience, simply because it's going to open a wave of things that you never saw possible. Sometimes when God says, I want you to go and tell this person that you know and I know will never tell or will never turn to God, you tell them because all of a sudden it's not about that person, but it's about the person in the next office over who's going to overhear your conversation and their life is falling apart, and they hear you and they come up to you later at lunch and say, hey, I know that they just kind of blew you off, but I want to hear what you have to say. You don't know the power of your words, but when all of a sudden you stop doing what God's called you to do, you're going to miss out on the opportunity to move in the way that God has called you to move. And when we worship, we focus on an audience of one. It does not matter what anyone else thinks about us, because if you're caring about what other people are thinking about, you're caring more about their audience of worship than the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's about God, not them. And if it becomes about them, then you are not operating in humility. You're thinking more of yourself. You got to think of yourself less. You need to put your attention on the King of Kings. You'll never see me or hear me say of how to worship, that you have to come to the altar, you have to do this, you have to do that, but you have to do something. Let me just explain for a moment. Just doing this is not worship. As you look at me, like, well, you're sitting. Now, I'm not going to judge you because you might be sitting and all of a sudden you might be engaging in prayer and you might be deep in meditation. But let me encourage you, if all you're doing is sitting and saying, oh, let me just watch the show. Watching the show is not worship. That's checking a box and saying, oh, I'm in the room today. Now, you might have a reason to say, like, you don't know, my knee is completely messed up. That's why I'm not judging the position that you're in, but you need to judge your heart of where's my heart at during the worship. Because I'm not your judge in that, but are you worshiping God? Are you giving him everything that you have? You see, when I'm watching sports on TV, I have two different modes that I go into. Mode one is when my team is winning and they're winning big. If you're a team of the other fan when my team is winning big, you're gonna know that my team is winning big. I'll start texting, I'll start rubbing it in, especially because I've learned to be cautiously optimistic. I wait until my team is up by 3 or 4 touchdowns before I start rubbing it in, because I've had too many moments where we're up by 10, and then I'm a Lions fan, so then we somehow lose by 11. I've been there. I've done that rodeo a couple times. So I wait until we're up big, and then I start celebrating. I get boisterous, and I get loud, and I get excited. But the other version of me is this. If you're watching me in my living room, I'm sitting there on the edge of my seat. I'm not saying anything, and my hands are on my head, my face is red, I'm pulling out little pieces of hair. I'm pacing the room. I've got something in my hand that I'm ready to throw at the ground. I'm just intense and I'm ready to go. When have we approached worship with that same kind of energy? Because I don't passively watch my teams. I'm engaged. I might be the loud fan that's celebrating that, look at what's happened, I'm sharing a testimony. Or I might be in the moment of I'm pacing and I'm praying because, God, I need you to come through on something. And I don't know how you're going to do this, and I don't know when you're going to do this, but God, you got to come through because this person needs you. Because I can exist in both of those planes. But I don't just sit on the sidelines and say, okay, God, it's another day. Can you just come back today? I'm ready to go. Can we say peace out to the world? Can we do that whole rapture thing? I want to scare some people and leave some clothes behind and make them think that everything. No, we're either on the team or we're not on the team. We're either excited about it and we're giving everything, or we're not giving everything. And when I watch sports that way, sometimes I even question and challenge myself, am I always 100% following God this way? When worship is happening, am I fully engaged? Am I giving it all I have? Am I fully focused? Because you can be that fully focused on God, I'm praying through something right now. Or you could be at the altar just jumping up and down and twirling around, just excited because God did something, and you're on the other side of it. But you need to be engaged in what God's doing. That David is this great praise leader of Israel. He comes back, and his wife is starting to challenge him and call him out. And David he gets ready to put her in her place. She plans to rebuke him. He, in essence, rebukes her back. And that David's answer indicates 3 different things. The first one is that God's choice was David over Saul's dynasty. You see, Michal was given to David in the first place because of David's bravery when he fought Goliath. But when David went out from underneath the good graces of King Saul, that she was taken and she was given to another man. And so now all of a sudden she's restored to David, and she's no longer that favorite wife anymore. She's down on the totem pole, and she never gave him any children. But he basically just says, look, you once were this, you're not that anymore. That you don't have the same value. That she grew up in the king's household. She was given first to David. She was given to then another man. And she always had this high, cushy life. And she's watching her husband, the king, make a fool out of himself, worshiping something that she can't see. Here's the thing you need to know, is you have to be ready, willing, and able to worship the king. That some people say, well, you can't see your God. Yeah, but I can see the effects of my God. I know what my God's doing. I know how my God's moving. And let me share my testimonies. Let me share other testimonies I know. Let me just begin to pour out what God Almighty is doing. And if you say, well, I don't have any of those stories, then get in God's word and start praying that you get some of those stories. Get in the battle. Get in the game. Number 2 is humility versus pride. That David isn't afraid to humble himself before the Lord because he knows God's character. That some commenters, when they look at David and you see this short ephod that he's wearing, that it potentially exposed himself to the lower class slaves when he was leaping in dance. It's possible, of course, but realistically, if David was truly wearing the garments of a priest, like the text indicates, he would have had underclothing underneath it so that it wouldn't have happened. Most likely, Michal was just embarrassed at her husband's dancing around like this. And that's where David says, you know what? I don't really care what you think. I'm worshiping the King of Kings, and if you've got a problem with that, guess what? I'll do more. I'm not afraid of being embarrassed. I'm not afraid of saying, you know what? Enough with this. I don't need that. I don't need people just saying, I need to be fancy. I need to be this. Don't worry, I'm not going any further. But in a certain moment, you have to say, I'm willing to change my situation or the way I am or my comfort level. I'm willing to shed everything that makes me look good, makes me look fancy, because it's all about God. There is nothing that we're taking here with us to heaven. His temple, not taken to heaven. The Ark of the Covenant, not taken to heaven. The gold, the silver, all this stuff is not taken to heaven. So who really cares? If I need to make myself look like a fool so people will see Jesus, then make me look like a clown. Because it's not about me, it's about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And the third thing was this, is the priority of worship. That David defends his act of worship is not for anyone's benefit but God's. But Cal only saw the exterior because she wasn't a co-worshiper. People will look at you and not understand because they're not a co-worshiper. They're not following God the same way that you're following God. And you have to say, you know what, I'm okay with that, because if I'm embodying the Holy of Holies as God is in me and through me and moving and leading me in the direction that he's calling me to go, then they'll eventually see it. Because God wants his presence to be seen by all, and I want them to see it through me. And when we understand the heart of God, we can have worship in complete and total freedom, and others will join in that worship because they can see what we have and they can see that it's different. You look at this world that feels so desperate and so lost and so lonely. It's because they're trying to find their identity in literally everything except God. And when they find it in God, then all of a sudden, wow, there's freedom here. If I can have the worship team begin to come forward, I've got a couple things I want to pull out of 1 Chronicles 16, and then we're going to go into the Revelation song. So we can understand the heart of worship, but what ways do we see David worshiping? Here's 8 ways from 1 Chronicles 16 that we see David worshiping. By the way, if you missed these, because I'm going to go relatively quick, myshores.church, click the message notes. These will all be there. Number 1, sing to him. 1 Chronicles 16:9. Sing to him, sing praise to him. From a young age, David wrote songs of prayer and praise to God. As a king, he made music an integral part of the worship service, appointing instrumentalists and singers by the hundreds. It's one of the reasons we start our services with worship, is because we want to bring the right atmosphere into the room. Let me challenge you with this. Go to a sporting event and remove all the music for the entirety of the 3-hour event. It would be boring. The music creates the atmosphere. In the same manner that when we're here, the music creates the atmosphere. Because it's not about them, it's not about me, it's not about you, but it's the atmosphere so that we are ready, willing, and able to hear God when God's ready to speak to us. We have to be ready for it. So sing to him, sing praises to him. Number 2 is seek his face. Seek his face always, 1 Chronicles 16:11. Seeking something requires more than just a quick look, a quick search. It's more than just saying, I'm going to go on Google because I have a quick question. No, it's you're going to inquire and take time to search this topic out. David always knew that seeking God could change a person's heart. Number 3, remember the wonders. 1 Chronicles 16:12, remember the wonders that he has done. David was continually aware of God's presence and wanted the people of Israel to share in that experience. But he knew the tendency to set God aside, especially when life was going well. To help prevent that pattern, David often mentioned God's past works in his Psalms. You want to make sure that you don't forget about God, start sharing your testimony with people on an everyday basis. Work God into every conversation that you possibly can. And if you do, you'll start realizing that you're not forgetting the wonders, that when all of a sudden life comes up against you, you can say, yes, that was a struggle, but remember when this happened. And you start building upon that, and all of a sudden you get to a spot where you can't be shaken. Number 4, proclaim his salvation. Proclaim his salvation day after day, 1 Chronicles 16:23. The word proclaim usually gives us an image of essentially what I'm doing right now, proclaiming God's word, but you can proclaim God's word to each and every person you come in contact with. It doesn't have to be in an audience of 50, 100, 1,000, 2,000. It can be one-on-one, and sometimes that is the most effective spot, is that one-on-one. Bring an offering and come before him, 1 Chronicles 16:29. David was faithful to give animal, grain, and wine sacrifices as his ancestors did. But he believed there was a deeper sacrifice in play that he could offer to his Lord. Overflowing with anticipation and awe, David let his praise pour out of his body on many occasions. He was ready, willing, and able to give of his time, his talent, his ability, his resources, everything. If God said, give it, he gave it. Church, it is time where we start saying, you know what? There is people who desperately need Jesus that will go to hell if we don't do something about it. Because God's already done his part. Now he wants to use us and work through us so that we can bring those people that have already had the ability to accept Jesus if they would simply know Jesus. And we need to send missionaries around this world. Some of you are going to be called in the years to come to go to be missionaries. Some of you are going to be called to go across the street. Some of you are going to be called to give bigger gifts than you've ever felt called to. Not because I need your money or this church needs your money, but because God wants to use you in your obedience. Because it's not about us. It's about giving up of what we have so that God's kingdom can grow because he's already given us so much. Here's the thing. There's so much that we could do as a church, but I need your help to do it. If for this church to act in obedience, everyone in the church has to move in obedience together. We have to bring an offering. If you've got resources where you say, oh, I have these resources, but does God really want me to give them? Yes. If God said yes, like Satan's not going to say, hey, give $1 million to the church, or give $100 to the church, or give $1 to the church. If God's speaking it to you, you know that's God, because Satan's not trying to give resources to the enemy. But in the same way, if you have abilities, talents, and you say, well, I really like kids, but you seem to have enough kid workers. Pastor Parker, do we have enough kids workers? We can always use more. You know why? Because God's going to move in this church, and this church is going to grow, and as this church grows, that means there's more kids. As there's more kids, I need more kids workers. But what comes first, the chicken or the egg? The kids leaders have to be there first so that we're ready to receive that harvest. The harvest is ready, but the workers are few. That there's so many things. If you gave me a list of, well, here's $1 million, what would you do? I could start rattling off a list and say, by the way, if you have a second million, here's what's going to come next. Because we need to advance the kingdom of God. Number 6, be glad. Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad. 1 Chronicles 16:31. David expressed many different emotions towards God in his songs and in his psalms, but the psalms all share the common theme of being glad for the goodness of the Lord. Today, the word glad sometimes gets interchanged with happy, but here glad has a deeper meaning of a lasting kind of joy. Here is a saying David might well have agreed with. Joy describes not only an emotion, but an attitude as well. We need to have an attitude of joy. We might be in a moment where I don't know how this is going to work itself out, but I know that my God is for me. I know my God goes before me. I know my God's preparing a way. It will get worked out, and I will have joy in my heart. Number 7 is give thanks. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. 1 Chronicles 16:34. Giving thanks was an essential part of David's worship life. In every season and every circumstance, he found reason to give honor to the King of Kings, to give worthy honor to God. And he tried to make it a habit and an example for Israel by making praise a regular habit in his Psalms. You could not look at David and not see him giving thanks. Instead of walking around as Eeyore throughout your day and saying, well, woe is me, like this, our nation's, it's never going to turn back to God. How about we start proclaiming what we want to see as truth instead of proclaiming what the news is telling us is truth? And in order to do that, that means we got to get up and start acting like it and living it out and walking it out. And number 8 is cry out. It says, cry out, save us, God, our salvation. 1 Chronicles 16:35. David had no trouble leaning on God. In his Psalms, he openly expressed how needy he was and called on his Lord without hesitation. He knew that crying out to God was an act of worship because he acknowledged God's control and goodness. So in calling out with a trusting heart, David brought God glory. As we go to worship right now, cry out. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what your situation is, what your struggles are, but here's the thing. Let's cry out to God. Let's remember the glory moments. Let's proclaim his truth. Let's give thanks. Let's start throwing off the things that would hinder us. Let me encourage you that even when you walk out of this place, you need to stay in this kind of atmosphere. Don't walk out of this room and say, well, church is done. Now I can complain about the world again. No. If anything, we should be, if you're saying, hey, I've got things to complain about, I'm going to move my shoes and I'll move my coat, and then you need to come to the altar and you need to get right before God and say, you know what? I'm done complaining about this world. I'm done complaining about leaders. I'm going to honor leaders. I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to be forgiving. I'm going to be all these things that David was so that we could see this world turn back to God. I believe another great revival is going to come before God comes back again. And will we be able to be a part of it, or are we going to be bystanders watching on the sidelines? Because that's not my desire. My desire is that this church would be able to impact our community and that we would see not just our glory days, but things that would make our glory days look like a church plant. It would make it look like, well, what's going on here? God wants to move. God wants to do incredible things, but we have to actually worship like it. Because the worship isn't just for him, but it transforms us so that we know when I'm facing struggle, I know where to go to. But the problem is when we can't even worship and give God everything that we have in this room, we'll never do it out there. So as we just go before the throne room right now, I want you to worship like you've never worshiped before. And I don't care what that looks like. I don't care what you need to do. Let's just worship the King right now.